Good morning. So today we start the Bible, which will be the final unit before the semester break. Hopefully this will be the most interesting section we do. It's certainly the most important because the Bible is the most important book ever. And it is driving a lot, it has driven a lot of history, it's driving a lot of history today. So if you want to fully understand the conflict in the Middle East, what's happening between Israel and Iran, what's happening in Palestine, you cannot do so without a full understanding of the Bible. At the same time, the Bible is, because it's so important, the ideas around it are very controversial. There are billions of people around the world who believe the Bible is the Word of God. It's Holy Scripture. Every word in the Bible comes to us from the divine, the divinity himself. And obviously, that's not what I believe. More so, I'm going to make arguments in this class that go against not only the traditional understanding of the Bible, but also the mainstream academic understanding of the Bible. So, to be fair to you, I want you to be very skeptical of what I say. Okay? Come to class with doubting my authority, doubting my understanding of the Bible. Okay? So feel free to challenge me, and I want you to challenge me because what I will say in this class will be extremely controversial. Okay? So, let me give you a brief introduction to the Bible, and then I'll explain some of the history behind the Bible, okay? And this overview is going to be very broad, very general, but it will help structure our understanding of the Bible for the next few classes, okay? All right, so the Bible. The Bible is Greek for books, and it really means library. So the first thing you need to understand is the Bible, it's a collection of different works by many different authors. So there's no worldview or consistency or continuity in the Bible. You can find whatever you want in the Bible because it's a library. It's a huge collection of ideas. There's about 2,000 pages. Okay? So there's very few people who actually read the Bible in its entirety. There are people who might read certain sections of the Bible, okay, but most people will receive their understanding of the Bible from authorities like priests or rabbis, okay? The Bible itself is divided into two major sections. The first section is what we call the Hebrew Bible. And so this was originally written in Hebrew, and this is the book of the Jews, okay? What do the Jews believe? They believe in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible itself is divided into three major sections. The first is, so the Hebrew term for the Bible is the Tanakh, okay? So you may hear some people say the Tanakh. It just means the Hebrew Bible, okay? The Tanakh is T and K. And this is the Hebrew term for certain ideas. The T stands for Torah or teachings. So this is the laws of the Jewish tradition. Okay, for example, the Ten Commandments, right? Second is N, which means prophets. And the prophets themselves are divided into minor and major. So in Rome, the people who are most admired are the generals, right? Julius Caesar, Pompey. In Greece, the people who are most admired are the poets, Homer and the playwrights. In the Jewish tradition, the people who are most admired are the prophets. These individuals who speak the truth of God. They're social critics, and they're people who challenge the authority of the kings in order to promote the laws and teachings of God. Okay? Does that make sense? The prophets are the people who are most admired in the Jewish tradition. And the third are okay, is writings. So basically, things that don't really belong in teachings and prophets, but which have some cultural or religious significance to the Jewish people. Okay? So this is the Hebrew Bible. And then we get to the New Testament, which is something that only Christians believe. All right? So Jewish people do not accept anything in the New Testament. The New Testament calls the Hebrew Bible the Old Testament. Okay? Why? Because the Old Testament is the promise of salvation. Okay? The promise of Jesus Christ. The New Testament is the deliverance or the fulfillment of this promise in Jesus Christ. Okay? It's a coming and the work of Jesus Christ. The New Testament itself is divided into many different works. It's a lot smaller than the Old Testament. So there are the Gospels. The Gospels is Greek for the good word. And the good news is that Jesus is on earth. And he's here to deliver us from our sins and our suffering. There's letters, mainly by someone named Paul. And these are the work of Jesus' apostles after the death of Jesus. They go around the world and they promote the gospel of Jesus, the good news. Okay? And this is about what they do. And then there's some other books as well, but the major one is called Revelation, which is about the end of the world. And it's the idea of the second coming. How even though Jesus is dead, he will return and he will bring peace, eternal peace, to the world. Now, from the Bible, in interpretation of the Bible comes the Quran. And this is the basis for Islam. Okay? So eventually we'll do all three. The Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran. But we'll start with the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Okay? So the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is what we'll start with. And to do so, I will have to teach you a lot of history. And this history will be extremely broad. Okay? But over time, I will be more precise. I will go into specific details about this history in order for you to better understand the Bible. Okay? There are three ideas about the Hebrew Bible that Jews believe, the Jews today believe, which are not true. Okay? The first idea is the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish religion, has always been monotheistic. Meaning, the Jews have always believed in one God. His name is Yahweh. And he is the God of the Jews since Abraham, who is the patriarch of all Jewish people. Okay? That's what Jews believe. I will show you this is not true. In the beginning, Jewish people, like everyone else, were polytheistic. Okay? Monotheistic is a modern idea that has been retroactively put back into Jewish history. Okay? So that's the first myth that I will correct. The second myth that I correct is that Jewish history or the Jewish religion has been continuous for at least 3,000 years, possibly 4,000 years. Okay? And what I will show you is that's not true. So there have been many major changes to the religion, and these changes are so drastic that you can argue these are very different people, okay? So the Israelites, the people who founded the religion, are very different from the people we call Jews today. And I will show you why in the next few classes, okay? That's one really important idea you need to understand. The history of the Israelites and the Jewish people are not continuous. All right? Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, any questions so far? Are you guys following along? Okay. So and the last idea is the Bible, or the Hebrew Bible, it's a historical record. And what I will show you is we've been trying for at least 300 years, 200 years to prove that the Bible is a historical record. Okay? There are archaeologists who've spent fortunes their entire lifetimes looking for things like Noah's Ark, looking for people like Moses. Can't find them, okay? And this tells us pretty conclusively that the Bible is not a historical record. It is a work of our imagination. Okay? It is a literary work. Now, it's a very powerful literary work, and that's what explains its relevance and its power today. Okay? I'll explain why it's powerful, but I want you to remember, it's not a historical work. It is a literary work. It's a work of our collective imagination. All right? Okay. Now, I'm going to talk a little about the broad history of the Israelite people. Okay? So, in the Bible, what it tells you is, maybe about 2000 BCE, there's a man named Abraham. And he's from the city of Uruk, okay? In Mesopotamia. Or is it Ur? Okay, it's one of the two, sorry. And then God, Yahweh, thought Abraham was the best man in the world. So God, Yahweh, made a covenant with Abraham and said, you are the most righteous and dignified man I've ever seen in the world, and I will make you a father of a new nation called Israel. Okay? And these people will become eventually the Israelites. And the greatest king of the Israelites is named David. And then God says to David, David, you are the greatest man I've ever seen. I love you as you love me. Therefore, I will make your house, the house of David, eternal. Okay? You, the house of David, will reign over Israel for all of eternity. I will make Israel into the mightiest of nations. Okay? So that is what it says in the Bible. The historical record is a lot more complicated. All right? So let's start in the year 1200 BCE. And this is towards the end of the Bronze Age, right? We're about to enter the Bronze Age collapse, which lasts about for 100 years. At this time, let's look at the world. Israel is in a place called the Levant. And the Levant has always been important because, as we discussed in previous classes, Levant was one of the first centers of agriculture. So Jericho is in the Levant. But it's also important because the Levant is where three major civilizations and empires meet, okay? They are the crossroads or the nexus of empire. These three empires are Egypt, which, again, for most of its human history has been the wealthiest and the most powerful nation. Okay? Over here is Mesopotamia, which is the creative civilization. This is where human civilization first developed mathematics, writing, astronomy, architecture. Okay? And up here are the Hittites, or Anatolia. And Anatolia, again, is extremely wealthy. So the Levant is sort of sandwiched between three extremely aggressive, wealthy, and powerful nations that are extremely advanced and sophisticated. So the Levant has always been a colony of either Egypt or Anatolia. Okay? It's not been very independent for very long, and it can't be because it's at the edge of empire. But because of its position, okay, the Levant is what we call a melting pot. or a meeting place. So every culture, every language, every religion that was imaginable at this time met in the Levant. Okay? Mainly for trade purposes, right? Because, again, Egypt and Mesopotamia are extremely wealthy. For the Levant, you can go across the Mediterranean into all of Europe and into northern Africa. Okay? So the Levant was really the center of the world for most of its history. And so it was a meeting place mainly for traders. Right? At this time, Levant was divided into different sections. A province called Canaan was a province of Egypt. And Canaan was special to Egypt because the Egyptians loved two things. They loved wine, they loved olive oil. And the Levant was very good at harvesting both wine, good wine, and olive oil. So, but the Egyptians didn't really like to go outside Egypt. So the people administrating the Levant were local elites tied to Egypt, but also foreign mercenaries. And these foreign mercenaries were from as far as Greece. Okay? And we know this because we've discovered Greek pottery that dates back to this period. These foreign mercenaries would then intermarry with a local woman because, as you can imagine, these are young males. Okay? You also had lots of nomads living in the Levant because of Arabia, right? Okay? Lots of nomads, people we call the Bedouins. You also had people living in the hills of the Levant, the hill people. Then you have these cities, okay? The Canaanites. You also had, believe it or not, Egyptian priests living in this area. Why would they live in this area? Well, because they had a certain religion that was considered heretical or controversial in Egypt, so they had to leave to practice their religion. Or maybe they were priests who got into a political struggle, and as such, they were exiled to the Levant. Okay? So, does that make sense? The Levant, it's not at this point a nation. At this point, it's really a meeting place, a melting pot of cultures, languages, and religions. It's as diverse as can be. And historically, this has always been the case. Right? Then what happened, of course, is the Bronze Age collapse. The thing about the Bronze Age collapse is you have this massive migration of people looking for food. Right? These are called the sea peoples. They're basically like pirates. And there are these massive waves of sea people attacking the Hittites, attacking the Levant, and attacking Egypt. And again, these are like refugees. Okay? This is a forced migration, and they're trying to feed their families. They basically overrun the Hittites. They destroy the cities of the Levant. And they almost destroy Egypt, but Egypt, because it's so wealthy, it's able to hold off the sea people. Eventually what happens is the sea peoples and Egypt come to an agreement and say, listen, stop attacking us and we'll give you land in the Levant. You can settle down there. You can grow your own food. You can feed your families. Okay? And this place is what we call Philistia. And these people are called the Philistines. So these are basically the sea peoples. Mainly Greek, actually. There are a lot of Greeks among the Philistines. But this creates a problem for everyone in the Levant, because now you have a foreign presence that is very aggressive and expansionist. Okay? So now the people in the Levant need to come together and fend off this threat from the Philistines. They also have these neighbors as well, these other cultures that keep on attacking them. Okay? So these are extremely diverse people, and So what they agreed to do is elect a king to lead them in war against the Philistines. And this person is named Saul, King Saul. All right? And King Saul is a very good king. He's a very good military leader. He's helping the people in the Levant fend off the Philistines and aggressive neighbors. Okay, so this is a military alliance. King Saul employs a lot of mercenaries. And one of these mercenaries is named David. David is an extremely capable, charismatic soldier who develops a following. David, as you can imagine, because he's very charismatic, is also very ambitious. And eventually, he has a falling out with Saul, okay? David is Saul's best general, best soldier, but David is too ambitious. And Saul sort of suspects David. So what David does is he runs off and joins the Philistines. Okay? He's not fighting for the Philistines. What's really important for us to understand, and I know it's a hard concept, okay? But borders and alliances and allegiances are extremely fluid at this time. If it benefits me, I'll fight for you. But if it doesn't benefit me, then I'll betray you, okay? There are different factions within all alliances. Okay, so the Philistines are divided among different ethnic groups. The people in the Levant are divided into different political factions. You have these hill people, you have these nomads, you have these foreign mercenaries, and they're fighting for different reasons. So these alliances are always shifting, okay? So David goes off and fights for the Philistines. King Saul and his sons are eventually killed in battle. And David sees a political opening. So he turns back into Levant, and he starts to politically maneuver to be the new king. Okay? And his power base is in a place called Hebron, or in south the Levant. But the House of Saul is still around. And so there's a civil war now going on. And eventually David triumphs. And then David's able to unite these people, and he creates a new nation called Israel. All right? And then Israel is able, under David's leadership, is able to basically put down any aggressions from its neighbors. And they're able to build an empire, a small empire, okay? Nowhere near Egypt, but it's an empire. All right? So this is what we know from the archaeological record. But David is so charismatic that when he dies, his son Solomon is not able to hold the empire together. So what happens is Israel divides into the northern kingdom and Judah, which is where the house of David is. Okay. Now again, the Levant is a very important strategic location. So as these empires, major empires, start to consolidate the power, they want to take over the Levant. Okay? So the Assyrian Empire comes in and destroys the northern kingdom. And then eventually, the Babylonian Empire will come in and destroy Judah. Okay? The Babylonians will take the Israel elite, basically the royalty, and force them to go to Babylon, where they will be held as hostages or captives. Eventually, what will happen next is the Persian Empire will come and defeat Babylon. And what they do next is very interesting. They decide they will release these Israelite elite, have them return to Jerusalem and Israel, and have them govern the Levant based on, and have them govern the Levant. Okay, does that make sense? And it is only at this point that we get the term Jews. Okay, this is a Persian idea, the Jews, before they're called the Israelites. And this is about 500 BC, okay? 500 BC. And now we have a radical departure from the tradition, okay? And so I'll explain three major differences. And then I'll go into detail about these differences in future classes, okay? The first major difference is Israel, under Israelites, it's a polytheistic religion. They have one God, Yahweh, but they also have a pantheon of gods, which is true for every other religion, right? There's a pantheon of gods. Yahweh is at the top, but they also celebrate other gods like Baal and Asherah, okay? We know because they're written down in the Bible. So we know at this point, Israel is still a polytheistic religion. But after the Persian Empire returns them to Jerusalem, they became a monotheistic religion, or the beginnings of a monotheistic religion. Why? Because when the Jews are released from captivity by the Persians, their religion merges with that of the Persian religion called Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism is a dualistic religion, okay? Meaning there's good and evil. So that's the first major difference. At the beginning, the Bible was very much a polytheistic religion, and then after the Israelites became the Jews, it became monotheistic, okay? Second big difference is this. Second big difference is, during this time, the people with the power in Israel were the kings, okay, the monarchy. But after 500 BCE, the Jews decided they didn't want any kings. And they couldn't have kings because their overlords are the Persians, right? So the center of power became the priesthood. Okay? The priests. The people with the absolute authority are the priests, not the kings. There are kings, but the kings are not subservient to the priests who speak on behalf of Yahweh. Okay? Because now it's a monotheistic religion. And then there's one other difference. The other difference is, remember, at this point they're polytheistic and they're kings, okay? Which means they are tolerant. They're welcoming of other religions, right? Because you're polytheistic. But also, as kings, you need to establish diplomatic alliances with other countries who have different religions, right? So when you marry someone from another political dynasty, you also are marrying into that religion. Does that make sense? So Israel, under the kings, is a very tolerant religion. But if you're run by priests, right, you become intolerant because you insist that your religion is the best. Okay? And that's why after the Persians lost control and the Greeks came in to the Levant, this is the Seleucid Empire, okay? The Jews rebelled against the Greeks because the Greeks were polytheistic and the Jews considered themselves monotheistic, okay? They refused to acknowledge the culture and the religion of the Greeks. And then things got really bad when the Romans came in, okay? Does that make sense? Okay, so this is the history of the Jewish people up until the birth of Jesus, okay? Any questions so far? Do you guys understand what's happening?
How did the Bronze Age collapse?
Excuse me?
How did the Bronze Age collapse?
Okay, so how did the Bronze Age collapse? Okay, we talked about this, okay? We don't know why it collapsed. The mainstream academic understanding is it was a perfect storm of several factors, including climate change, including civil unrest, including natural disasters like earthquakes, okay, including competition among empires. What's important to understand is when we talk about the Bronze Age collapse, we're really talking about basically this area. If you go east to Mesopotamia, where the Assyrian and the Babylonians are, they're fine. Okay? And it's the Bronze Age collapse that allow the Assyrians and the Babylonians to eventually become world powers. So the Bronze Age collapse was not a global phenomenon. It was a localized phenomenon to the Mediterranean. Okay? But why the Bronze Age collapse is important is because the Bronze Age collapse will give us Greek civilization, Homer and Plato, okay? It will also give us the Bible, right? Because if you look at this history, Israel would not have come into being without the Bronze Age collapse. Egypt or the Hittites would continue to control the Levant, right? And it's important to understand the Greeks and the Bible are the basis, the two fundamental pillars of Western civilization. You understand? That's why Westerners are so fascinated by the Bronze Age collapse. Because in their minds, the Bronze Age collapse is part of God's divine plan or design to create classical Greece and the nation of Israel so that his vision for the world can be achieved through Jesus. Okay? Yep. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Okay. So that's a good question. So the argument I'm trying to make to you is the Bible says Abraham is a patriarch of the Israelites. But the historical record, the archaeological record is we barely have evidence of David. We have absolutely no evidence of anything before David. Okay? So I think David is the founder of the nation of Israel, not Abraham. Next class, I'll explain to you why they constructed this mythology, okay? All right? But first, I want to give you a broad overview. All right? Next class, I will explain to you where these ideas, Abraham and Moses, came from. It'll make sense when I explain it to you. Okay? But do you guys have any more questions before I go on? Yep.
Can you clarify on how the Israel religion merged with Zoroastrianism that made them?
Okay. Right. Okay. So, what happened during the Persian period, right? Okay. So at this point, the religion of Israel is no different from the local areas. It's a polytheistic religion with a pantheon of gods, okay? And maybe Yahweh's at the top, or maybe Yahweh's co-equal, okay? We don't know. And at this point, there are many divergent religions, okay? But what happens is Babylon conquers Jerusalem, and then the Jews are sent in exile. So now their religion is sent overseas. And the religion is detached from the culture and the people. Does that make sense? And what we know is when you do that, when you detach the religion and you put it into a place that has no interactions with the local people and the culture, it becomes much more fanatical. It becomes much more focused and fanatical. Okay, do you understand? Okay? Do you understand? Because if it's in Israel and there are different cultures, the religion has to be tolerant and police different factions among the people. Okay? Does that make sense? But once this religion goes off to Babylon, it's now divorced from the people, from local reality. So the elite can design in a way that they think is most appropriate. And we call that fanatical. Does that make sense? So an example of this, okay, it's a bad analogy, but maybe this will help you. Right now, you're not sure what it means to be Chinese. Okay? You're Chinese, but Chinese in China is a very fluid, very diverse identity. When you go off to America, right, then you have much more concrete, much more clear understanding of what it means to be Chinese. Your Chinese identity becomes much more formed. Does that make sense? Okay? And the same thing with religion. Within Israel itself, the religion is constantly changing. It's very fluid. But when they're off to Babylon, they have to use the religion to survive as a people, as an identity. And so it becomes much more formed, okay? Much more concrete. Does that make sense? And then what happens is, now that it's much more concrete, it now interacts with Zoroastrianism, which is the religion of the Persians. And at this point, the religion becomes basically what it is today. Okay? So I'm sorry, I don't think I've explained this clearly to you, but I want to wait until we get to this period, okay? Right now I'm just giving you a broad overview. Okay? Any more questions before I begin? Before I continue? All right. Now I want to talk about the Bible, okay? Because the Bible is the mythology. It's a collective memory of the Israelites, okay? And so I'm going to discuss why the Bible was first created in this class. And what I will explain to you is the Bible was first created in order to explain and justify and create legitimacy for David. Okay? This is what we call an apology. And this is a very common practice. The idea is this. Most kings, every king, obtains power through really nefarious means. Okay? They either kill a lot of people to obtain power, or maybe the younger brother kills the older brother to usurp the throne. Okay? Usually, kingship requires ruthlessness. But the problem is, when you're ruthless, you have a legitimacy problem. Right? So the way that most kings resolve this issue is by sponsoring writings or an apology to explain why he or she is king. And the answer usually is because God willed it so. Because I had no choice in the matter. I'm not ambitious. I was not at all ambitious. But the circumstances forced my hand. To save my people, to do God's work, I had to kill my brother. I had to kill my enemies. Even though I myself am not a violent person. Okay? That's usually how the apology goes. Okay? So remember, back at this point, the very idea of writing, it is new. It's a new technology, but it's also a very expensive technology, meaning you need to buy the materials, okay, which are rare, but you also need the people to be able to write, okay, and they're also very expensive. And you basically need it to be able to support a team of scribes to create any work of fiction. So writing back then is like movie making today. Okay, it's a very expensive endeavor that was usually sponsored by the king in order to justify or explain why he is king, in order to create legitimacy. Okay? Does that make sense? So the Bible was created first as an apology for David and explains why the house of David is now in charge of Israel. But as we discussed, okay, eventually the house of David, Israel, divides into two nations. Now the house of David, the Bible, goes with the house Judah, okay, to Judah. But the northern kingdom now needs its own mythology, its own Bible, right? And so a second Bible was created. The people who are in charge of the Bible, the priest class, are interested in promoting their own interests, mainly in the points of ritual. It doesn't make sense? Like, what are rituals? Why do we need them? Why are priests important? Then you have people at this point in the Babylonian captivity looking back at the history of Israel and trying to figure out why the House of David collapsed. And their answer is because the Israelites refused to follow the will of God. Because the Israelites became polytheistic or they became immoral, okay? Does that make sense? In other words, the Bible at this point are divided into like 4 major factions or schools, okay? The school that supports the House of David, the legitimacy of the House of David is called the J school, okay? The J school. Don't worry about this. I'll explain to you next class what these things mean. The people who support the northern kingdom as legitimate house of Israel is called the E school. E. The school that supports the power of the priests are obviously called the P school, okay, for priests. And then the school that tries to go back in history and examine why Israel fell, and which believe it's because the Israelites betrayed God. These people are what we call the D school, okay? The D school. So E, G, P, and D. And these are just 4 of the major schools. There are other schools as well. All right? And so at this point, the Bible is divided into like 4 major schools or documents controlled by different factions. When the Persians take over, okay, they insisted, you need one religion, guys. You need one document. And so all 4 were put together to create the Bible. But the way they did it was very interesting. All they did was just put them together, okay? You understand? So if you read the Bible, it's like A, B, C, D. A, B, C, D. Okay? So one line is from the E school, the next line is from the J school, the other line is from the P school. It's very confusing to read. If you don't understand this history, it is impossible for you to read the Bible. I'm not sure if you've tried to read the Bible, it's not readable. Okay? So why would they do this? Why would they just put all 4 texts together without major editing or revisions? Why? Do you guys know? Why would they do that? They just made a complete mess of the Bible. But why would they do that? Okay, so let me explain. The first major reason is most people didn't read or write back then. So the Bible itself didn't really matter. What mattered was the oral explanation of the Bible controlled by the priest class. Does that make sense? The people didn't read the Bible. So how the Bible was actually written was not that important. It was important for the priests to have access to the Bible, okay, but the people didn't actually read the Bible. That's the first reason. The second, more important reason is because the Bible is political real estate. And I want you to remember this idea, okay? It's the most valuable political real estate in the world. Everyone wants to be in the Bible because to be in the Bible gives you legitimacy. It gives you power, right? So, if you're a king, you have 4 sons who all want to be king, well, your best solution is to divide the kingdom among the 4 sons, right? Same with the Bible. You have 4 extremely powerful schools and political factions. So the best way to resolve the issue is just to say, listen, we'll put you all in the Bible together, okay? And when you merge them, it's a lot easier than if you just try to do it by order, okay? Like E school goes first, and J school, then P school, then D school, okay? They just put them all together. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is a very important idea. The Bible is the most valuable political real estate in the world. Everyone wants to be in there. And what ideas you can find in there will ultimately shape human history. Okay? Any questions so far before I continue? All right. So the last thing I want to talk about today is the apology of David, which is the beginning of the Bible. Okay. So when kings come to power, they have three major problems, right? The first major problem is legitimacy. What gives you the right to be king? Okay. Second problem is the idea of identity. And this is a huge problem for the Israelites because the Israelites, it's a multicultural entity. You have people speaking different languages, different cultures. They practice different cultures, they practice different religions. So now you need to create an identity that everyone accepts. Okay? The third thing is differentiation. You need not only for these people to get along, but you need to get them to divorce their former culture. Does that make sense? Because you have Egyptian priests in there. And you have to tell these Egyptian priests, you're now Israelites and you're not Egyptian anymore. And the example that we use for this is Augustus Caesar and the writing of the Ennead. Okay? Remember, the Ennead, it's a book about a character named Ennius. And it provides political legitimacy to Augustus Caesar because Augustus Caesar is a direct descendant of Ennius, who is the founder of Rome. Also, what the Ennead said is Augustus Caesar is the end point of Roman history. Everything before Augustus Caesar led to him. Augustus Caesar is like the Jesus of Rome. Okay? He is the salvation, he is the redemption of Rome. Okay, that's what the Ennead does. Okay? Second thing about the Ennead is it creates a new Roman identity that focuses on piety, loyalty over liberty. Remember the problem for Augustus Caesar was Romans didn't like kings. Well, now he's a king. So how do you get people to obey? Well, you tell them piety is more important than liberty. All right? The third idea is the Ennead, remember, it's anti-Greek. The problem for Rome at that time was Greek culture was vastly superior to Roman culture. And so a lot of Romans were adopting Greek cultural practice like Mark Antony. And so the Ennead said, Greek culture is like the Trojan horse. If you let into your city, Greek culture will corrupt you and destroy you. Okay? So, guess what, guys? Every king has to resolve all three issues, okay? Legitimacy, identity, and differentiation. And that's what David is trying to do with the Bible. Okay, so I'll give you three examples, three stories from the Bible that illustrate David's quest for legitimacy. Next class, we will talk about identity and differentiation and how the Bible achieves that, okay? But for this class, I want to focus on legitimacy. So, now that David is king, a lot of people don't think he's legitimate. Why? Because he ruthlessly tried to usurp the throne from Saul, right? Saul is the king that everyone picked or elected. And he was a good king. He was good at war. He was someone that most people liked. And David stole the throne from him, okay? So now, what is David's problem now that he has a throne? Others will try to steal it from him, right? You understand? Because if you, David, if you set the precedent, if you steal the throne, then others are now empowered to steal the throne from you as well. Okay? So the first thing the Bible does, the apology for David does, is show us David loved Saul. He was not at all ambitious. He cared only for the well-being of his king. Okay? And so one story that illustrates this, there are actually many, many stories in the Bible that does this, but one story that illustrates this is this. So Saul thinks David's trying to kill him. So he's chasing after David with his army, okay, trying to kill David and his followers. One day, Saul is alone in a cave, praying to God for deliverance. David sees Saul alone, and he sneaks up behind Saul. Then he takes his sword and cuts a piece of Saul's clothing. Okay? And then David disappears. Saul leaves the cave, and then David rushes to him and says, Saul, my king, I beg of you, give me a second. Let me explain to you. Back then in the cave, I could have killed you. This is a piece of clothing to prove I could have killed you. But I didn't, because I love you, because I'm loyal to you. I would never kill you. And then Saul says, oh, this is proof that you never meant to kill me. Okay? And this is a story in the Bible. Obviously, this story cannot be true, okay? But this is what the Bible is trying to do. It's trying to first show us that David is not all ambitious. In fact, the entire apology of David is focused on the lack of ambition of David. Okay? So that's the first story. Let's look at the second story. Okay? The second story is this. Saul is dead, and his son, who's a young man, comes into the throne. There's a general named Abner, okay? Abner, who was loyal to Saul, but now that Saul is dead and David is very popular among the people, Abner sees the political winds changing, and Abner tries to align himself with David. So Abner writes a long letter to David and saying, listen, I will swear loyalty to you, and will end the civil war between the house of Saul and the house of David. You will unite Israel. And then David writes back and says, yeah, come to me. I'll give you a feast, and then we'll be friends. And so Abner comes, David gives him a feast. And then as Abner leaves, he runs into David's general named Joab. And Joab and Abner go a long way back, okay? They were friends, they were enemies. Abner killed Joab's brother. And in an act of anger, Joab stabs Abner to death, okay, and Abner is dead. And once Abner is dead, the house of Saul basically gives up, and David is able to unite Israel. Okay, now that's the story in the Bible. David is so angry by this that he curses Joab, and he gives Abner a great funeral. Right? Because David does not want to betray his friends. Why is this story wrong or completely made up? It's not made up, but it's what we call spin, right? Clearly, Abner and David had a feast together, and clearly Joab killed Abner. But why is the Bible version of this event wrong or incorrect? It can't be true. You guys know? Okay, this is hard, okay? But the reason is this. If you're David and you're king, which person in the world are you most afraid of? If you're the king, there's a person in this world you're most afraid of, or you're most suspicious of. Who is that person? Abner. Okay, yeah, he is suspicious of Abner. But in general, you should be suspicious of Joab, right? Because Joab has access to your army. Abner is your enemy, but Joab has access to your army. So if Joab wants to betray you, he could. Okay? So in other words, because David is most suspicious of Joab, if Joab were ever to act independently, then David would need to kill him. Does that make sense? And in this circumstance, Joab acted independently. David told Joab Abner was an honored guest. And Joab didn't care. He was angry about the death of his brother, and he kills Abner. This cannot possibly be true. You understand? Joab had to kill Abner because he was ordered to by David. Right? Now why would David want Abner to be killed? Because in his mind he thinks, oh, if Abner can betray the house of Saul, he can also betray the house of David. He is an ambitious man. And why would he think like that? Why would David come to this conclusion? Because he himself is like that. Do you understand? He himself betrayed Saul. So he's very, very careful or cautious about people who betray their leaders. Right? Abner betrayed the house of Saul, and it was very likely that he would betray David at some point as well. And so David had to have him killed. Right? But he could not say this publicly. Because if you were to say this publicly, then it would show he, in fact, knew this because he betrayed Saul. Does that make sense? The logic of this? Okay? But you can see how wonderful the spin is. It's almost impossible to see the truth from this, right? If you're a person, you know, okay, David, you know that Joab killed Abner, and you were told the story, you would believe the story. It's just because Abner was angry that he killed, it was just because Joab was angry, he killed Abner. Okay, you believe that, right? But you think about it, it can't be true, okay? Now, I'm going to give you one more story. And this story is actually even harder to figure out because of the spin. Okay? Now that David is king of Israel, Israel has many enemies. So his armies are always at war. Okay? One day, David is on the rooftop of his house. So, and Israel's not a very rich place, okay? So these are not palaces, they're just houses, okay? And so David is strolling on his rooftop, and across from him is a woman named Bathsheba. Bathsheba. And she's bathing naked. And David is overcome with lust. He's like, I must have this woman, okay? And he's king. He orders his servant to go get her. She comes. They have sex. Okay? The problem is, we have sex, but she gets pregnant. Okay? The problem now is, Bathsheba's married to a man named Uriah, the Hittite. And Uriah the Hittite is one of David's best soldiers, and he's fighting for David and Israel somewhere else. So David's like, oh, this is a problem because once Uriah comes home and he finds Bathsheba has a new child, he's going to know it's not his. So either he's going to kill her or he's going to figure out it's David to come kill him. Okay? So David, being very clever, has a solution to this. He invites Uriah back home. Okay? So Uriah comes home from the war, and Uriah thinks, oh, the king has called for me. Therefore, it's an emergency. Okay, so he rushes back, and David meets Uriah at his house, and David says, listen, Uriah, you've been doing such a great job. You're such a great soldier. You're so loyal. I want to give you a vacation. Go home and be with your wife. And Uriah's like, my king, my comrades are dying. They're starving out in the battlefield. I cannot abandon them. How can I find pleasure in my wife when my friends are suffering? I refuse to go home. I will not go home until the battle is won. And David tries his best, but he can't convince Uriah to go home. So then David tells Uriah, you're such a great soldier, you're so loyal, I'm so happy and proud that you fight for me. And he gives Uriah a letter to his general, Joab, okay? And the letter instructs Joab to kill Uriah. Joab will send Uriah with his soldiers out in the battlefield. And then at the last minute, Joab will recall his soldiers, leaving Joab by himself. At this point, the enemies will swarm Uriah and kill Uriah. Okay? And that's what happens. And once Uriah is dead, David marries Bathsheba. And they're about to have a child together. At this point, David is visited by a prophet named Nathan. And Nathan says to David, I want to ask you a question. And David says, sure, go ahead. Nathan says, let's imagine there are two shepherds. There's a rich shepherd with 100 sheep, and there's a poor shepherd with 2 sheep. There's a traveler, a foreign guest, who comes into town, and the rich shepherd wants to honor him with a feast. The rich shepherd steals the poor man's shepherd to feed the traveler. Who's in the wrong? And David says, of course the rich shepherd is in the wrong. He's indignant. He's angry. How could a man be so unrighteous as to steal another man's sheep? And then Nathan says, you, David, are the rich shepherd. You have violated God's law. You are in the wrong. And as punishment, God will take away your son or your child with Bathsheba. And that's what happens. And David goes into mourning, okay? He is distraught, he's depressed. And he writes a lot of poetry. Okay, so this is a very powerful story. And this is a story that has captured the imagination of everyone for 1,000 years. But it's complete spin. This is not what happened, okay? How do we know? Okay, first thing is this. Nathan says to David, you have stolen a man's you have stolen a man's wife. Therefore, you're in the wrong. What's the problem with this logic? What is David's crime? Real crime. Guys, he killed Uriah. Right? You understand? You've forgotten this fact. He had Uriah killed. That's the real crime. He killed Uriah. Yeah, he slept with Bathsheba. That's bad. But it's much worse if you murder someone, okay? So another question then is, why would he murder Uriah? Why not just talk to him honestly and says, Uriah, I'm sorry, I love your wife. I had sex with her. I'm sorry. Why did David have to get Uriah killed? Why was Uriah killed? Yeah, because the army is loyal to Uriah, right? So why would David fear Uriah? Because Uriah is a popular, brave soldier, just like David. And David used his popularity in order to usurp the throne from Saul, right? Therefore, David thinks Uriah could do the same thing to me. Therefore, I have to get him killed. In other words, this Bathsheba thing must have come later to disguise the fact that David killed Uriah because he feared Uriah's popularity. Does that make sense? Right? You see how clever this story is? The historical truth must have been David feared Uriah's popularity. And he needed to get rid of Uriah. So he concocted this plan. And then, after he killed Uriah, he needed to explain to his army, okay, who loved Uriah, why this happened. And then they was like, oh, because I fell in love with his wife. I couldn't control myself. I'm just a man. Okay? God is God. I'm a man. I'm a king. I can't be God. I can't control my emotions. Right? Does that make sense? But the irony of this is because David is working so hard to disguise his ruthlessness, he's creating very powerful literature. He created a very powerful story that has captured the imagination of readers for a long time. If you think about it, if you think a lot about the story, it unleashes a lot of ideas in you. Okay? You have to ask yourself, what is man? What is God? Are we capable of controlling our emotions? So in other words, this story is extremely well constructed that inspires you to imagine your own personal and emotional and moral life. We call this literature, right? So, guys, it's no coincidence that today the Jewish people are the most creative people in the world. When you go to America for university, most of your professors are Jewish. Most of the best thinkers in the world are Jewish. These past 200 years, there have been 3 revolutionary thinkers. Karl Marx, Albert Einstein, and Sigmund Freud. They're all Jewish, who have been raised in the Jewish tradition of asking deep questions about what it means to be human. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay, any questions about this?
So why would people during that time believe like the apology of David?
Okay, that's a great question, okay? So the question is, why would people believe this apology of David? And, well, the answer is most didn't believe the apology of David, okay? Most were very clear about David's ambitions. But when you're king, you need to impose your reality on others, okay? So this is why this is written. And so it was written for people who were part of David's political coalition. Do you understand? His enemies wouldn't believe this, right? But it was basically meant to appease or convince those who want to believe David. Does that make sense? Okay, spin. And it happens today, guys. When you watch the news, it's spin. Right? It's distorting reality. And so most people will believe the media, right? There are some people who will never believe the media. Like, I don't believe anything the media tells me, whether it's Chinese media or American media. I know a lot of history to understand the media is distorting reality. Okay? But most people will believe this because they have absolutely no interest in not believing it. Right? David's king. If you don't believe it, then you have to believe your king is a murderer. Okay? Does that make sense? Yeah, Echo?
What's the mainstream understanding of this story?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Okay, this is really important. What's the mainstream understanding of the story? So the mainstream understanding of the story is it has to be true. Why? Because it puts David in a bad light. Do you understand? And it shows the genius of David because David is wrestling with his own morality. David is being honest. Right? So the mainstream understanding is David is a poet king. He's a man who prays constantly and engages in a process of self-reflection. And that's what makes David great. Okay? He's constantly praying to God. In fact, the Bible just goes on endlessly about this, how David is constantly in communication with God. And in this communication, he's praying and asking for light, for truth in his own weaknesses, okay? To be delivered from his failings as a man. And the Bathsheba story is emblematic about this, because why would a man make this up, right? Well, I've told you why, but most scholars don't see that. Most scholars think, okay, well, this Bathsheba story puts David in the worst possible light, therefore it must be true, and therefore it shows us David is a poet king who is constantly thinking about his own moral failings. And so he's an inspiration to his people. Okay? That's the mainstream understanding. Okay. Any other questions? Yep. That's right.
So how would they know literature?
Oh, okay. So the question is, if people at that time were mainly illiterate, why was this written down? Or how would they know the story? Okay. So the idea is this. First of all, this was written for the elite, for the people around David, to know what story to tell people. Does that make sense? Okay. This was for internal consumption. And this was to basically preserve David's historical legacy. So maybe 20 years from now, when everyone's dead, when people who knew Uriah and Bathsheba were dead, well, what is truth now? The truth is what's been written down, okay? That's why they're saying history is written by the writers. Right? History is not written by the winners. History is written by the writers. Right? Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. Any more questions? Okay, great. So next class, we will continue the Hebrew Bible, okay? Because it starts off as an apology for David, but it evolves into a much larger mythology, right? So that's next class.